Ciao friends! In this video we're going to see how to implement common concepts as month-to-date, quarter-to-date, year-to-date applied to dashboards you create in Power BI where you don't have any date selection. When you create a report where you just have a number and you say this is the month-to-date, usually you mean it's what we sold this month up to today. But this notion in Power BI could become hard to implement. Every day we have a report, maybe that in reality we mean what we had in our data until yesterday or until the last date where we have some data. And this becomes especially important when you are, for example, at the first day of a new month or when you want to compare data with the same period in the previous year. You want to consider the same range of dates, the same number of days where we have some data. So we have time intelligence functions in DAX like quarter-to-date, month-to-date, but they work in a relative way compared to the current selection of the date. This creates some confusion sometimes when you just want to see a number with the definition, oh, I want to see the quarter-to-date, up-to-date is implicit. We will see how to implement this notion in Power BI with a couple of techniques so that you have several options depending on your preference, depending on your requirements, you will choose the best one. We will also take a look at the new calculation groups user interface in Power BI Desktop. So let's start with a demo. So I prepared a Power BI file where we have the common time intelligence calculations we usually obtain by using time intelligence functions in DAX or by implementing a DAX pattern or by using Bravo for Power BI, which is, for example, what I have in this model. Now, the common calculations we have for the time intelligence are visible here, something that like the year-to-date, the quarter-to-date, the month-to-date. And these calculations have been designed in Power BI in order to be applied to any date. Indeed, if you look at this report, you see that for every year, quarter, and month, we actually have a year-to-date calculation that works up to that point in time, which means, for example, that the value for April is the sum of the year-to-date from the 1st of January of 2019, in this case, the corresponding value for the quarter one, plus the value for April, and the same for the following month. Which means that year-to-date doesn't mean the current year up to today. It means the value for the selected date until that date from the beginning of the year. This makes it possible to create calculations like I want to compare the year-to-date for this period compared to the year-to-date of the previous period. If you didn't have a behavior like this, a relative behavior like this will not work. However, this creates a problem. Common requirement we have is that we would like to have something like this, something like a dashboard where we apply a number of measures, the sales amount, delivered amount, and many different time intelligence calculations like those that we see in this report that should work with the data up to today. But guess what? If we have a refresh happening every night, probably today means yesterday. And if today is Monday, maybe that it means Friday, up to Friday. And this becomes important, especially when you consider that if you want to make a comparison, you actually want to see the data until the last day available. And even though this last day is, for example, 2, 3, 4 years ago, you need to create the same distance with the previous period for any comparison. Let me clarify this with an example. Let's consider the last data available for this dataset. It's very old. We are in 2023 now, and this data is up to 2020, but this amplifies the problem that I want to describe. We can see that in this dataset, for example, the value for sales amount is available until the 3rd of March, but if we look at the two measures we consider, sales amount and delivered amount, we probably have the last data available on March 11. So this is the last day where we have some data. What does it mean? It means that even though I am in 2023, if I want to see the data for the year to date, I should consider the last day available in the data. Probably this doesn't happen with a distance of 3 years. But the idea is that if I'm in April or if I'm in March, but I'm in my current date is, for example, the 20th of March or maybe the 12th of March, I still have to consider the 11th of March as the last day with data. And when I do the year to date with the previous year, with a comparison with the previous year, I have to compare the 11th March of 2019, not the year to date up to date for the 2019, because I would include 1, 2, or 3 days more. And so here is the problem. How can we obtain, with the minimum effort possible, all these calculations that we want to include in the report so that they behave for a dashboard like we expect? The quarter to date, the month to date, the year to date should work for the current period, which means give me the last day available. Now, in Power BI, we have slicer that can be configured so that we get a relative distance in dates, which means that I could filter, for example, the current day, but or the last day, or the next day, or the last week or month or year. But this means that this relative date concept works because if we include the slicer and we apply a selection to the slicer, every day the actual date filter will be different. Unfortunately, this slicer cannot consider the data that we have in the report. It only applies a filter based on the current day. And so it doesn't look at the data. And we just explained that we want to obtain a behavior that actually look into the data, especially when we want to do comparisons. Not to mention that if I use, for example, something like give me this month, what happens when you open this report on the 1st of October and you have data until the 30th of September, or maybe earlier than that? You don't see any data. Just like now, I see blank. What I really want to do is, instead of applying a filter for using this slicer, using this technique, I would like to apply a filter. So let's remove this slicer. I would like to apply a filter. Now, without any slicer, I see the grand total for sales amount for any date. What I would like to do is to apply a filter over date. So let's move the date column, for example, for this visual, but I could apply this filter to the entire page, and I could select the last date where I have some data. Now we know that the last date where we have some data is something like 11th of March, something like that. So if I go to 20, I think we have to go back to 2020. It was March 11, something like that. So this is the filter I want. And if you remember, that filter doesn't have any transaction for sales amount. We only had delivered amount. But at this point, if I include in this visualization my month-to-date calculation, so let's take a look at the measures available. So let's search for month-to-date sales amount, something like that. So if I drag and drop this here, you see that now I have my month-to-date sales amount visible here. And this is the month-to-date up to the date. Problem? That's good, Marco, but what if we want to make this dynamic? Because if I apply a filter like this in the filter pane, it works for today. I publish the report, but tomorrow it should be a different date. And important, this should be a dynamic concept because it should be something based on the data, not on the current date. So how do we solve this problem? Of course, there are many ways, but let's take a look at a very efficient one we can use. So we will see two techniques, one based on modifying the date table and applying a calculated column just to have a column to filter in an easy way. So we will create a column where we say, okay, this is the column that we want to filter with current date or last day, something like that. So we obtain the filter we want. The filter in the report will be always the same, but every day with a new refresh of the data, the content of the column will change so that we will shift the filter to another set of dates. And the second technique we will see is based on calculation groups. And we also will consider what to do if we can modify the model, because modifying, adding a calculated column requires adding something to the data model. But if you cannot modify the data model because you are not able or you don't want to add a calculated column, we will see with a calculation group another technique that can achieve the same goal. I say using a calculation group because if we modify the measure, which is possible, then we have to create a lot of measures just to obtain a behavior that is always the same. We only want to filter a particular date based on the content of our model. So this is the description of the problem. I know, pretty long, but I wanted to clarify what's the goal of what we're going to do now in DAX. So let's go back to this report. Basically, what we want to do now, we want to enable a filter in this card visualization so that we filter only the last day for which we have data, which we know is something like March 11. I probably have to sort by date here, otherwise this doesn't work, but that is my last day with some data. So let's say that from the month point of view is March 2020. So as I said, the idea, the first approach we want to use is to modify the date table. So this is my date table. This date table has been generated by Bravo for Power BI. So we have a number of columns available that also provide useful information that we will see can be very useful, like for example, having this year month number or the year quarter number we have in this column. These are useful concepts when we want to implement some filter for the current month or the last month with data. But in reality, the first goal we have is just to identify the last date where we have some data. So as you see, we already have a column. So let's pretend we don't have this column, and let's create this column from scratch, because probably in your model you have to do that. So we create a column that we call date with transactions. Let me enlarge the font. And we want this column to be true when we know that in the model we have data that is useful to display the data that we want, and false in, let's say, date in the future. So it should be true until a certain date, the last date that we consider, let's say, that today date for our analysis, and false for everything else. So the goal is to obtain just a true-false result. And the first thing we have to do is to detect which one is the last date we want to consider looking at the data. In this case, I create my last transaction date variable, where I want to get the maximum value that I have, for example, in the sales table, in the order date column of the sales table. So sales order date. Now, of course, this is an easy way to implement that. Sometimes you have multiple dates in your model, and so all the dates that are connected to the date table should be included in this analysis. So, for example, for the purpose of this example, I want to use only sales amount and delivered amount, so I want to use order date and delivery date from the sales table. So now I have two columns that I had to consider, and so I have to get the maximum value of these two columns. So this could be one technique I use to get this last date where we have some data. However, what if we have more than two values? Well, another idea is to write a maxx, provide a table constructor with the columns that we have, so in this case just two, and so we create a table that has only two rows in this case, but it could be 3, 4 or more, and so you have direct control over the date columns that you analyze. By the way, remember, Bravo for Power BI already generates this code for you, but I wanted to explain how you can implement this technique in your model where you have maybe another date table. So at this point, the value I want to check is this one, and so this is the version I prefer to use, and of course at the end I want to return the last transaction date. So now, this is just the date. If we take a look at the result we have, is just a date, but as I said, we want to obtain a flag, true, false. So what we have to do, we have to check this date, the last day with transactions, with the current day in the date table. So actually the date column that we have here. When this value is less than or equal to, when the date is less than or equal to the last transaction date, then we want true, otherwise we want false as a result. So we transform this column into a Boolean value, true, false, and we now have exactly the behavior we expect. If I scroll down until there is the cut between true and false, we can see that, here we go, we can see that our calculate column behaves just like date with transactions, which is a column we already have. I just wanted to provide you how can I obtain the same column in my model. Now, at this point, what we can do is we could filter this column. So we could filter this column equal true, but in terms of how do I obtain something that is easy to understand in the report, I suggest to create a second column so that we have a more meaningful name that is also easier to filter. Filtering a Boolean value for some reason in Power BI is not that easy. And so what we're going to do, we're going to create current date column, which will have the field, let's say, which will have a name identifying the date that we want to identify as the current date that we want to use. So out of these dates with true, we want to get the last one. So we want to detect what is the maximum value in date that has that flag equal to true, and we want to add a label so that we can easily filter that day. And so that filter will be stored in the report, will never change, but every time we refresh the model, the label will move to another date. And so when you open the report, you will filter another date according to the data that you have in the model. Let's do that. So we create another column now, which is the column that we will make it visible for the user. And this column could be current date. You could use another name if you want. It's just the name I thought when I wrote the article, and you will find all the details and the demo file in the article. Look at the link below in the description. So last date with data is the variable where I want to compute the value of the max date data. So this is my goal. So I also want to show you how I write that. So I want to get the maximum value of max date date, but I want to restrict this to a filter context where we know that our last date, sorry, my column date with transaction, this one, is equal to true. Now, I could have used my calculate column, is the same. They are actually the same. You will find that this is the column I use in the article. But if I do this, this is not enough, because remember, we are creating a calculate column. The calculate column in the table has a row context. Calculate triggers a context transition, and we will see only one day, the current day. So we want to remove the filter from the context transition because we want to actually look at the entire table, just filtering this flag. This way, we obtain a single day. Let's take a look at the result. So last date with data. And if I go here, you see that the last day with data is actually the last day where we have some data. At this point, I can just compare this value. So if the last day with data is equal to date, so the current row, then I return last date with data. Now, you might think, and of course, again, you don't like this name, you can write whatever name. This will be the name visible in the slicer for the user that has to create the report. The goal for writing this code is to explain that why am I doing all these steps? Well, remember, my date with transactions could be already implemented in the date table, and I want to separate the logic where I evaluate what is the last date with the transaction from the idea of creating a label, a tag that allows me to filter a date that has a particular property. You could use the same technique to tag all the days in the current month, in the last month. So this idea can be applied to different things. The only limitation is that if the same day belongs to different labels, you need to create multiple columns. Having a single column with different labels means that every day only has one label. And if you think for a moment, the last date is also the is also one day that belongs to the last month or to the current month, depending on the point of view. So depending on what you want to do with this technique, you might want to create multiple columns. Each column is very cheap. It's just two values, very high compression. Only one value has the actual string, all the other values are blank. So in terms of cost, is very, very inexpensive to create columns like that. What we get at the end is, when I click enter, you see that most of these rows have blank. But when I reach the last day with a transaction that is true, you see that I have my flag here, my string, last date with data. My goal now is to use this column, current date, equal to last date with data, as a filter in my report. So I go back here, and for example, in this case, just in the card visual that I have in this report, I just want to apply the filter here because I don't want to affect, for example, this other matrix I have at the bottom. So I just want to filter my set of KPIs that I displayed in an area of my report. So what I have to do, I have to look for the calculated column I created, this current date. I move this column into the filter pane, and as you see, I have only, in this case, two values, and I want to filter last date with data. As soon as I do this, bang. Now I see that for the last date with data, we have no sales. If you remember, March 11 didn't have any sale. We have some value for delivered amount, but the month to date, up to that date, is described in these two values. Same for quarter to date, same for year to date. But what is important, when we look at the year to date, look at these numbers. The year to date sales amount is compared with the year to date of the previous year up to the day, in this case March 11, that we found this way. If you think for a moment, not having this technique will make it extremely hard to obtain the right number, because you will probably compare the entire year or the entire quarter or the entire month, depending on the selection that you made, like we have seen the way the matrix works. So this is actually an effective way to obtain the result that we needed, and it just works. But of course, what we have to do if we want to achieve this goal, we have to extend our model. We have to create a calculated column. If you're doing this with, let's say, a composite model, so you connect to a published dataset where you already have a date table, you can technically create a calculated column in the local model, but this calculated column will be computed every time, and maybe it could be expensive. I don't think it's a very expensive calculation overall. It adds some overhead, but it could be something just that you don't want to do for some reason. So now we're going to see an alternative technique that is actually pretty similar. We just don't extend the table. We just work on creating another table that in reality is a calculation group. The calculation groups are a recent addition in the Power BI editor. So we have, at the moment of recording, this is still a preview feature you have to enable. So sooner or later, this will be available also without a specific activation. But now we have to activate it, click OK, and restart Power BI. Now that we restarted Power BI Desktop, we can see that in the model view here, we have in the calculations area, we have the calculation group button. Now, with the calculation group, we can actually create a table that will have our last date with data. But the advantage of using the calculation group is that we can list other selections, like the last month with data, the current year, the previous year. You can create your own selection of dates that will be used as a starting point for your measures. So let's start creating a calculation group in Power BI Desktop. So the first thing you see is that in the model view, we have these calculation groups. In this case, I have only one calculation group named calculation group. We will rename it soon. And for each calculation group, we need at least one calculation item. So the calculation item we're going to create is the calculation item that we will call last date with data. So last date with data is the name we will see in the table that will be our selection, our possible selection. And what we have to do in this measure is that we have to execute whatever measure is selected by specifying a filter over the date column so that it matches the last date with data. But let's assume that we don't have the date with transaction flag, so we want to create a code that can be applied to any date without extending, without creating calculated tables. So the first thing we have to do, we have to rewrite the last date with data business logic, where we computed the maximum value of a list of columns we have. So max of sales order date and max sales delivery date, something like that. Delivery date, this way. So let's format this a little bit better. So let me save just some line so that I have more space available. And this is my max. I have to just write value. I have to write max x, and this way I have my calculation. But if I do this, of course, this will be executed in the current filter context. We want to have the same behavior we have seen in the calculated column. And so we write a calculate statement, a calculate function, where we remove any filter. So this way, the result of this calculate will be always the same regardless of the position in the cells or in the report, which means also that the engine will be efficient because it has to compute this value only once. Once we have this data, what we can do, we can calculate the selected measure we have in the current execution of the calculation item. The calculation item is triggered when a measure reference is executed. So we actually want to execute the original measure, no differences, but the only thing we do, we apply a filter to the date column in the date table. That must be last date with data. Now, with the same logic, we can actually write other calculation item. But before doing that, let's take a look if this works. So we go back to our report. Now we go in a page I prepared where I have the same card visual with many measures, not filtered at the moment. So what we do this time, we go in this calculation group, which is a table. Now we probably want to change the name of this calculation group. We could call this calculation group like something like period. So this way we have a period selection. I want to also rename the column period here. So now it's like I have a table called period, so column period in the table period. But this period column now has only one possible selection, last date with data, which means that if I don't apply any selection, the calculation item is not applied. If I apply a selection, that calculation item is active. So when I click this, I have the same filter we have seen before, the same behavior. And so basically you could apply this to an entire page if you just want to apply an automatic filter over date according to your business logic. I would say that one advantage of the calculation group is it makes it easy to actually provide more choices. For example, what if we want to provide another line, which is last month with data? So we can create just another calculation item. We write last month with data, last month with data. Now, let me go back to the previous one, because actually what I want to do, I want to copy the same code just as a starting point. And let's write this code here, because the last date with data is always the same, but now I want to create another variable, another calculation that computes the last month with data. What does it mean? If we want to apply a filter over the entire month, so we know that we have a date, a single day, and now we want to extend this filter to the entire month that include that date. Of course, there are functions, in time intelligence functions that do that, but in my specific date table, I have a column that represent the year and the month together. This column is called year month number. We also have a string that is what we display, but I prefer to use the numeric column because I know that if I get the maximum value of that numeric column, I get the last month where there is some data. So what I can do, I can use something, for example, like a lookup value. I say, oh, if I filter that specific date, what is the corresponding month? I could have used also the month name, to be honest, for this particular example, but let's use date, year, month. I could use year, month, or year, month number. I prefer to use the number, where the date is equal to my last date with data. So by using lookup value, I don't have any problem with filter context transition, or other things like that. Now I just have the year, month number. What can I do with this? Well, I can just use this value, last month with data, to filter exactly this column in my calculate. So in my calculate, instead of filtering the day or the date, I filter the year, month number that must be equal to this variable. And because now I'm applying a filter to a column that is not date, I have to take care of removing the filter from the other columns of the date table. Because only when you filter the date column in the date table, you have this automatic remove filters applied to the calculate statement. When you filter other columns, you have to remember to do this in your code. Date, entire table, that's the way to go. So if I do this now, you will see that my calculation now provides a different option where I have last month with data. And by using last month with data, of course, I change the behavior so that now sales amount and delivery amount are showing not just the value for one day, but the value for 1 month. All the other measures work the same, but the idea is that now for month to date, and if you do a month to date over previous month to date, you are still considering the entire month for the previous month. So be careful, maybe this is not what you want, but I just provide you options to create this. Now, we have seen one version of this period calculation. We could have another one. So let's duplicate this calculation item, because I want to show you another version of this calculation where we don't have dependencies on specific columns of the date table. Let's say, so the technique I've shown you is actually very efficient if you have these additional columns, so a column that represents year and month together. But if you have only a column with the 12 months and another column with the year, filtering 2 columns could become expensive. At that point, you might want to just use a time intelligence function to do that. And so the idea is that we actually have DAX time intelligence functions that can do the job for us. So instead of doing this filter, so we know that we want to filter the month corresponding to the last date with data. A function we can use is called parallel period. Parallel period has a first argument, which is the column, the date column of the date table you want to filter, and we want also to pass as a parameter the filter we have for that column. So in this case, the best way to obtain that is to use the function treatAs, where we provide a list of just one date. Oops, something happened. This completely disappeared. So let me, I had to start again. So it's a preview version I'm using, so probably something didn't work well. So let's repeat this again. So no date dependencies. And let's restart from here. And I was trying to write here a filter where instead of using the technique I have shown you, I want to use parallel period, and I want to use treatAs to filter, to convert a table that has only one date, the last date with data, into a filter for the date column in the date table. So this parameter becomes the parameter to parallel period, saying this is the filter I have. I also want to obtain as a result a list of dates for this column, date, and I want to get an offset of 0 month from this date, and I want to get the full period. So the result of parallel period is the full month, all the days in that month from the date table. And so this is another technique we can use. I would say that this is not more efficient than the other one. The other one is actually probably faster, but this is another approach that doesn't require additional columns into your date table. This is just another technique. I think that I also have the final example you will find in the article. We can take a look at this example. As you see, I forgot that I used the current period, not period, in the name of the calculation group. If we take a look at the definitions available in the calculation group, we have several calculation items. We have the last month, we also have the last quarter. And if we take a look at the formula for the last quarter, we see that we have basically the same approach with lookup value. We just use year quarter number instead of year month number. And for the version with parallel period, we just change the last argument of parallel period, saying we want the current quarter instead of the current month. You can do the same for the year. You cannot use weeks for the DAX time intelligence. So we have seen that by using calculation groups and by using calculated columns in the date table, we can implement an effective way to create filters for existing measures so that they can work also, assuming that the current date is the way you define the business logic for month to date, quarter to date, year to date, assuming that you don't just want to get the current date as the filter, but actually the current date is what you use to start the search for the last date with data that you want to use to get a fair comparison for your reports. As usual, enjoy DAX!